All right, good morning and welcome to the Coffee with a Coalition series hosted by the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking. My name is Michael Wiesman and I am the Chief Operations Officer here at ICASA HT. Today is our last Coffee with a Coalition of the year, and we will continue in 2025 on the third Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. Our next training will be January 21st at 10 a.m. with sexual assault nurse examiners Angie Morris and Ashley Smiley. They'll talk about navigating service gaps and in Indiana, and registration links for this topic and Spring Core 40 will be posted in the new year. Before we get started, I'd like to go over how to participate in our event today so that we know who is in attendance and can call on anyone who asks questions. Please be sure that your first and last names and pronouns are displayed. To use the features needed for today's event, please hover over the bottom center of your screen. You will see a series of buttons. Participants may view captioning by clicking on the captions buttons at the bottom of your screen or under the More button. Next, click Show Subtitles to view captions at the bottom of your screen. The mute button can be used to unmute your microphone when you are called upon. All lines have been muted at this time. Please click on the chat button icon to open the text box on the right-hand side of your screen. During the designated Q&A sessions, you may raise your hand to comment or enter your question in the chat box. The raise hand button can be located at the bottom of your screen under the More button if it's not visible. You may submit comments or questions for today's presenters in the chat box at any time during the presentation. Questions entered regarding the presentation may be addressed immediately or during the designated Q&A session. ICASA HT staff will be monitoring the chat box to help relay questions to the presenters. This session will be recorded. The recording will be available to participants through their original registration in January. If you have to leave the session for any reason, you will also be able to view the recording through the online learning platform. Once posted, ICASA HT will notify participants and provide instructions on how to access the materials. At this time, I'd like to introduce Beth White, President and CEO of ICASA HT, and thanks for everyone for joining this morning.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning. It is great to see some familiar names and faces and some not so familiar names and faces. Thank you for joining us. I know it is this close to the holidays. There's a lot going on, and we are just pleased to have you all engaged with us this morning. As Michael indicated, this is the last Coffee with the Coalition for this year, and it is the topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is legislation and the legislative process. We're also going to do a few slides about what we've accomplished this year and looking forward to 2025. So, Michael, are you driving the PowerPoint for me? I think he is going to. There we go. Wonderful. All right. So we have got some slides for you this morning. I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions because this is a topic that does create lots of questions. And my goal for this morning really is to do some education around lobbying in the legislative process, but also I'll talk about some things that we expect are coming up. Michael, you are not on the first page of my presentation, so let's see what we can get figured out. He's going to figure that out. We have some new staff, which there is a place in the PowerPoint for me to introduce them, but while we're waiting, I might as well go ahead and do that. So thanks for all the ICASA HT team for joining us this morning. Sharon Birdsong is our not the newest, actually. Sharon's got 4 weeks under his belt, so he's a veteran at this point. But Sharon, welcome to the team. He is working with Whitney Nixon on our prevention team. He's our coordinator. So Sharon, great to see you. In addition, we have 2 additional staff. As some of you know, Mariah left us back in October to take a different job, and we, while we miss her a lot, we realized that her job was so intense and difficult that we had to have 2 people replace Mariah. So I will leave aside the whole, we have to hire 2 men to replace 1 woman because we have hired 2 people, 1 man and 1 woman. And they are Anthony McLean. Anthony, if you're on camera, can you wave for us? There he is. There's Anthony. Great. And then the other new employee is Anesu Namuchiwa. So Anesu, you are there, and if you would wave as well. And the two of them are going to be taking our communication and also events and education responsibilities. So there'll be more about that in the new year, and you'll also have an opportunity to engage with all three of those new staff members in the new year. Michael, let's go to the next slide. This is our agenda for our time this morning together. We're going to review a little bit, talk about what's coming, and then dig right into the whole lobbying and legislative engagement. This will be a review for some of you because I've done this presentation before, but I think it is timely because we are looking forward to the new legislative session. And also it's probably always good to review some of this information. So Michael, go ahead. So we're closing out 2024. 3 new staff, as I just indicated, and there are their titles for you. We also have one more opening, which is our coordinator of sexual assault response. And we are rarely close to making an announcement about that. So that will probably be announced in the new year. So we will then be fully staffed, and I'm excited about that. We cut the ribbon on one new rape crisis center, which is Hope's Voice. And that is over on the west side of southwest side of Indiana. So that was exciting in 2024. We have 2 new SASP stands for Sexual Assault Service Providers. That's Beyond the Violence in Hope Springs. And we are wondering how many ribbons we might cut in 2025. I've got my big teal scissors ready to go. So we are taking seriously our responsibility to do a service expansion. And that is important. We also began work on a Center for Disease Control and Prevention grant. That is Whitney's wheelhouse, along with Sharon, who is her coordinator. And there'll be more about that coming in the new year. Some of you have already engaged with our work on prevention, and that is exciting. There were some national milestones in 2024, which were, I think, bittersweet as we closed out the Biden presidency, because Joe Biden, when he was a senator, was very involved in both of these particular aspects of the federal landscape. So it was the 40th anniversary of FIPSA, which stands for the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, with lots of acronyms in our world. And then the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act, which was actually authored by then Senator Joe Biden, now President Joe Biden. And that actually brought us the Office of Violence Against Women at the United States Department of Justice. So that's an important milestone 30 years ago this year. And the VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act, was reauthorized. And so we are looking forward to what the new year and the new administration is going to bring as it relates to that work. So a little closer to home, what's coming for us in 2025? We are renaming the organization. Actually, it's a new name, but an old name for those of you who've been around a while. And I'm looking at you, Linda Wilk. Not that I'm calling you old or anything like that, but Linda is one of the deans of our work around here. We used to be in CASA, then we were ICESA, then we were ICESA HT, and because of a loss of human trafficking funding, we can no longer do the state coordination work that we have been doing. So HT is going to be dropped from our name. We're going to have a new logo, a new website, and new branding associated with our new name. And so that is coming in the new year. And while it's certainly not something we celebrate, the loss of our HT funding and our ability to do that coordination work, it does require some different branding for us in the new year. We're going to continue to do all the other sexual assault response work, including the prevention work that we've been doing, education, advocacy, technical assistance, and we're going to engage with the General Assembly. And that's really the topic for this morning. But before I launch into our discussion about legislation, I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions about any of the things I just said. I cannot see, actually, I can see the chat. I just need to, yeah, yes, Linda, we are also very sad. And I know that Karen Maher is with us this morning, and I want to publicly acknowledge Karen and all of her hard work over the course of the last 2 years that we've been working together. And we don't yet know what is next for Karen, but I'm relatively sure it is going to involve this important work, which has been the work of her life for the last number of years. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no additional questions, let's just launch into our legislative priorities. Before I talk in specific detail about these legislative priorities, I do want to say a couple of words about the landscape. 2024 has been an interesting year, to say the least. It's been a tough year for some of us. One thing that I have learned in my many years of working in government, public relations, and also politics is the one thing you can count on is things are going to change. And so we are looking at change, both at the federal and at the state level. We have a new governor, we have a new president. We are going to have all new cabinet level office holders at both of those levels. We've got some new local officials, including new county commissioners, some new prosecutors, and new folks that we're working with around the state. And change is hard, and change can also be a little bit scary. But we here at the coalition are continuing to be committed to engaging on behalf of all of you and engaging on behalf of the work that we all do together. And while it could be time to spend an hour catastrophizing about what might happen, we're not going to do that because I don't think that that's a great use of energy or time. We're going to be intentional about the things we will talk about during this legislative session. One thing about being in the legislature is that you're playing offense and you're playing defense. And this list are the 4 things in particular that we'll be working on in an offensive posture. And I don't want, I use that word in the analogy of offense and defense as opposed to being offensive, which I try not to be. But one thing about the legislative process as well is you can have goals, but we've got to have others come alongside, including members of the legislature, to help us accomplish our goals. And then we play defense on things that come up that we either are not expecting or we don't think are good public policy. And then we try to engage about those things to either kill them or change them or make them less bad, if I can say it that way. So I've been working in the legislature for a long time in my career, and it is a process that you can predict all you want about what's going to happen, but you can never really fully understand how things are going to go until it gets going and gets started. So these are the 4 things in particular that the coalition in consultation over the last couple of years with a number of leaders, including Linda Wilk, who is on the call, have really come up with as important goals for the environment statewide. The first, of course, always is funding. This is important work, and nothing important can ever be done without sufficient resources. Those resources are both human and financial. We have to be able to pay the bills, and our service providers, all of you, because you're on this call, care about this work, and I'd suggest to most of you that you're probably funded by either federal or state dollars or some combination. And so the funding environment is really important, of course. And we know about the Victims of Crime Act, which is VOCA, is a pot of money at the federal level, which is not very well sustained. And that's because instead of having it be what's called an appropriation or just a decision at the federal level to put money into that pot, it is the pot is populated by white collar crime settlements from the Federal Department of Justice. And that is a really bad way to fund essential government services. Most other essential government services that we think about, both at the local, state, and federal level, are funded in a way that's much more predictable, much more clear and determined every year. But this particular pot of money varies greatly depending on what else is happening with white collar crime settlements. And so the pot fluctuates a great deal, and it is very frustrating because most of us depend on VOCA funding, and victims of crime means every victim of crime. That means homicide victims, property crime victims, sexual assault, child sex crimes, all kinds of other crimes that people experience. So the VOCA funding is not just sexual violence, but all different kinds of victims of crime. And there are more than 200 organizations in Indiana that depend on this funding. And everything from legal service providers to rape crisis centers to domestic violence shelters to Mothers Against Drunk Driving to organizations that do restorative justice work, homeless shelters. There are a number of organizations that benefit from this funding. And because the amounts fluctuate so greatly, there's a lot of stress. And we are going to the legislature to ask them to appropriate an amount of money from the state budget so that we can have some clarity and we can depend on that funding in a way that is sustainable. That's work that's been in process for about 3 years now, and every other year in Indiana we have a budget session. So we do a budget session in the odd number of years, which is after a general federal election. So that's 25, that'll be again in 27. In 23, we had a budget session. And so we're going to go and ask the legislature to appropriate an amount of money. That is the most important priority that we have. And it is something, as I said, we've been working toward for a while now. And I'm going to put a lot of energy into hoping that we can be successful. Are there questions about our VOCA replacement funding efforts? We are going to talk an awful lot about this, and all of you will be have access to information about it. But I did want to make sure that I highlighted it as the most important thing we're working on. Second thing we'll be working on is a statute of limitations adjustment for rape and child molesting as a level 3 crime. There's a lot to say about this, but in Indiana, rape and child molesting as a level 1, which is the most serious kind of felony, has no statute of limitations. Just taking a step back, a statute of limitations is the period of time in which a prosecution can be initiated for a crime. And in Indiana, we have a kind of a varied table or matrix is a word I could use because it's really complicated for various crimes. But the most serious crimes, rape, child molesting as a category 1 or a level 1, murder, aggravated felonies like kidnapping and major assault with serious bodily injury have no statute of limitations. A case can be initiated anytime. Rape and child molesting as a level 3, which are those crimes without what we call aggravators, is a 5-year statute of limitations in Indiana. And many of us feel like that's not long enough and that we ought to make an adjustment. Other states around us have made that adjustment to either eliminate the statute of limitations or make it a longer period of time, 15 years, 20 years. And we tried this last year and did not succeed, although we made good progress. And that's the other thing I can say about the legislative process is that we often have to go back year over year to accomplish major goals. It is somewhat rare, actually, in Indiana that we accomplish major policy change in the first year that an issue is brought to the legislature. So we're feeling confident this year that we will make better progress with changing this statute of limitations issue. So that's going to be our second legislative priority for this year. Are there questions about that? Okay, well, there's more to come on that as well, and I will be keeping all of you updated about the progress that we are making. The third legislative priority for this year is actually something that we are not driving specifically. We're coming alongside the Criminal Justice Institute in Indiana, which is, as all of you, I think, know, it's an organization, it's a state agency, which is run by Devin McDonald and his team, and they are our pass-through for all of our federal dollars that relate to the work we do. That includes VOCA, that includes SAS for the sexual assault service provision pot of money, that includes the DVPT, which is a domestic violence pot of prevention and training money that the ICADV group helps administer. That also comes through the Criminal Justice Institute. And they have decided this year, I like to say through our urging, but I can't really say that for sure, that the Victims' Compensation Program has too low a cap on the amount per incident per victim. It's currently 15,000 per incident per victim, which is one of the lowest in the country. And we have advocated for some time that they raise it. A better amount, we believe, would be $25,000 or $30,000 per person per incident. Some states have as high as $50,000. We've done research on this and worked with our partners at ICJI. They are putting forward a piece of legislation to raise it from 15 to 20, which is what I would consider a baby step, but it's better than no step at all. So we are going to come alongside our partners at ICJI and also advocate for this policy change. And we believe that this policy change is important. Again, I believe it ought to be higher than that, but again, we have to, moderate our expectations, I guess. And ICJI will take the lead on this. And again, we will come alongside and tell them and say to the legislators, we support this as well. We believe this is an important public policy change. Now, something came in the chat, which I believe is either a question or a comment. Yeah, thank you, Haley, for your question. We are taking the lead with a coalition of others. And we put this coalition together more than a year and a half ago. And it includes all of the service providers that I mentioned a minute ago, the legal service providers, the other victim services groups, domestic violence shelters, ICADV, the Domestic Violence Network, all of the umbrella groups. The child advocacy centers are big recipients of VOCA dollars. And many of you do this work, but if you don't, child advocacy centers are the place in most counties where child victims of any crime, not just sexual violence, but any crime, can go to get support, to be interviewed by law enforcement, to receive services that will help them. And so our CAC partners are also a part of this. Yes, organizations should be on standby for activation. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about what that can look like. We also have documents that are on a website called, Michael, remind me, Help Indiana Victims. Michael's going to put
IndianaVictims.org. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Michael's putting it in the chat. And it is a website where there is information. There is a great infographic document, and I'll say great because I helped draft it. But thanks to our graphic designer and others who have helped provide information about it. So what is going to be needed, of course, and Linda, thank you. Talking points and the document that I'm talking about is going to be very important for purposes of talking to your legislators. And Linda, who knows everybody in Grant County, is acquainted, I think, a former coworker with the new representative, Lori Gross Reeves, who I believe is a social worker. Linda, do I have that right? We've got a social worker in the legislature, which I think is good news for us. And we will be talking about ways in which you can activate your relationships with legislators. Yes, she is a social worker. Good. So she understands our work. And in a minute, I am going to talk about details about how that can happen legally without you running afoul of the federal rules. But all the information that you need to do that is available on the website that Michael put in the chat. Thank you for that question. And thank you, Linda, for your information. Any other questions or comments about the first three before I talk a little bit about rape kit issues? Okay. So the fourth legislative priority is a little bit less concrete than the others, primarily because when you talk about rape kit backlog, use those three words together in a sentence, it's not 100% clear what you're talking about. This is a complicated issue. And depending on who you ask, there is no backlog at the state lab, or there is a backlog at the local levels, or there is not a backlog in Lake County, who has its own lab, but Marion County has its own lab as well, but there is a backlog. So it's complicated. And there are a number of legislators who want to create some reform around the issue of rape kits and how they're handled. And what I know about this issue from working with some national partners who are very involved is any solution requires resources, just like I was talking about a minute ago with VOCA replacement funding. And it is unclear whether there is an appetite in the legislature to fund issues around the handling of rape kits. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't try, and that doesn't mean that there aren't efforts already to put forward reform. But to be honest, I am not very hopeful that there will be meaningful reform on this issue this session. Part of it is, again, because it's complicated, and part of it is because real reform will require more resources than I believe the General Assembly is willing to devote. And having worked in the legislature for a long time, one has to prioritize. And I've put our list of priorities in this order for a reason. I am more focused on VOCA replacement funding than I am rape kit reform. If the legislature says to me, there is money, but only for one of your two initiatives that require money, what'll it be? And it will be VOCA replacement funding. And so that is just the reality. It's not to say that rape kit issues are not important. It's not to say that there shouldn't be work associated with these issues, but I am crystal clear about where our priorities are going to be this year. Are there questions or comments about any of that? I know it's a lot. And I also know that often you don't even know what to ask when you're talking in particular about the legislative process. So I'm available now or anytime in the future to answer questions about any of this. And don't think that right this minute is your last opportunity to ask me questions about it. All right, so let's launch into what is lobbying. Because what's important about this process, of course, is that you got to know what you're doing and why and how, or you could potentially get yourself in a little bit of hot water. So what is lobbying? Well, when we talk about lobbying, we use some terms that I want us to make sure we clarify. Direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying, and then just general advocacy. These are three topics or three categories of activity, some of which you are absolutely encouraged, not only permitted, but encouraged to do. Some of it is regulated very closely by our state and federal government, and therefore you got to be real careful when you're doing it. And that's what I'm here for, is to not only try to explain all of this, but also to be the person who is directly lobbying on your behalf, because these are rules that I'm familiar with, and also we have the resources and the structure in place to figure it out. So the last item here, guiding principle, is that activities must be nonpartisan. And in other words, because we are federally and state funded, and because we are not for profit, the 501c3 category is the Department of Revenue Code, which creates us as organizations. And I don't think anybody on the call, at least none of the names I recognize, work for a for-profit organization. So as a not-for-profit 501c3, we are not permitted to be partisan, except in specific instances. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So Michael, why don't we go to the next slide? So grassroots lobbying is something that you often see with organizations like Women for Change or Planned Parenthood or NAESV, which is our national lobbying organization, or other organizations not in the sexual violence space, talking about things that need to happen. Like if you see a billboard that says, you know, every child deserves a family, right? That is grassroots advocacy on behalf of foster parenting, or you know, adoption of special needs children, right? That's not saying this bill and this legislator need to do the following thing. It's saying these are things that we believe are important and need to happen in our community. And it might be specific legislation, but it might not be. Direct lobbying has to do with a very specific piece of legislation during a session when the legislature is convened. And that can include meeting with them, calling them on the phone, sending them a letter, seeing them at a community event, being out in the public. You know, depending on the kind of community you live in, your legislators may be very prominent. They may be around having town hall meetings or other kinds of engagement opportunities. In a place like Indianapolis, that's a whole lot harder because we have lots of legislators and their districts are really kind of complicated to figure out. I know who my state rep is and my state senator, but lots of folks don't. But in places, I think, for instance, like Marion, Linda knows her folks because there really aren't that many. And you can engage with them directly. So this chart, I hope, is helpful to you to describe and talk about what these different kinds of activities are. Michael, let's go to the next slide. This is a list that comes from the website down below. I'm not going to read it to you. But these are things that you can do as a not-for-profit. And they involve really what I would characterize sort of as education and engagement with your legislators. You do important work in your community. You need to talk about that work. And the audience for talking about that work can be legislators, it can be city council members, it can be a mayor, it can be county commissioners, it can be a school board, it can be other groups, including funders, community foundations, private foundations. You need to talk about your work because building support for your work and for the survivors that you serve requires you to talk about it. And these things are important. And this is a list of things that you can do as a not-for-profit. Michael is putting another in the chat. Michael, that looks like another resource. Or that is the same resource, but putting the chat in the website in the chat, Michael. Is that what you're doing?
That's right. Yeah, that's
Great.
Just the link on the slide.
Great, wonderful. So that list of things you can do, and of course we're going to make these slides available to you so you don't have to memorize or write down that list. But here are some things that federal law in particular, and we're going to get to state law in a minute, talk about as it relates to things you cannot do. You cannot specifically influence specific legislation or a political candidate or campaign on behalf of a specific candidate or a public question. Now, the public question thing's a little confusing, and depending on where you live in the country, there are lots of public questions on your ballot or not so many. I know all of you voted in this past election, because if you didn't, I'm going to cry many tears, but I'm just going to assume you did. And if you lived in a place where there were judicial retention things on your ballot, we had a whole bunch of them. Instead of electing our judges in Marion County, they are appointed, then we retain them. Some of you may have had some tax referendum public questions on your ballot. About 10 years ago, maybe more, our legislature did a thing, and I'm not going to comment on whether that thing was a good thing or not a good thing to do, but they required government entities, mostly school districts, to ask their voters to raise their taxes. That's a public referendum that has to be on the ballot. And that may have been a question on your ballot, and that's considered a public question. And so not just candidates running for office, people, but also public questions are things that you cannot specifically, as a 501c3, advocate about. Let's go to the second caveat or federal guideline. Here it is. This is one long sentence that I'm sure a lawyer drafted because we are terrible. This is terrible. But if you read federal legislation, this will look familiar. It's a very long admonition to you about what you cannot do with federal money. I'm not going to read it to you because it makes my head hurt just trying to read it, but you are all capable of reading it, and it essentially clarifies, I guess, what the previous slide said. And then the next slide is another caveat, which is in particular VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act, was reauthorized in 2005, which, believe it or not, is almost 20 years ago. It's hard for me to believe because I remember when it happened, but it reiterates specifically that the grants that the Office of Violence Against Women program administer, which are all the grants we've been talking about, FASP, VOCA, there's some federal domestic violence related funding as well. All of those things are subject to the section that I just put up on the slide, which is the very long sentence about what you can't do with federal money. Now, I'm going to stop there just real quick and ask if there are any questions. I know there are questions, but we're going to go to the next slide and try to unpack this a little bit, because I know it's complicated and it's my job to read federal law and try to explain it to you. So that's what we're going to do. As an organization, don't participate and intervene in a political campaign. So I'm going to use Linda as an example because I keep calling her out and I'm going to do it. Linda runs Hands of Hope in Marion, and she also serves Grant County. So if Linda were to use Grant County letterhead and funds, federal funds from Grant County, from Hands of Hope, and send out a letter that said, this person should be elected as our state representative because she is a social worker and really cares about sexual violence and really wants to help us. And she's my friend and I like her and you should vote for her. That would be a violation of a couple of things. Not only the funding that she gets, but also the admonition of her 501c3 status. Okay. Now, Linda, as an individual person, has a First Amendment right to do various things, including help a person running for office, wear a t-shirt at a community event, write a letter on Linda Wilk personal stationery, that sort of thing. Now, you have a First Amendment right to do that, but I'm going to give you another caveat to the caveat, which is, as a leader in an organization, you have to be very careful. Because, and Linda's a really good example of this. Everybody who lives in Marion knows Linda Wilk because she is a leader in her community and has been running Hands of Hope for a very long time. And it is often difficult to separate her personal First Amendment rights from her relationship with the organization. And so I ask you to think about that issue when you're doing specific engagement on political campaigns and public questions. Because it is, as I said, often difficult to separate the individual from the organization. And I'm going to stop there and ask if anybody has questions about that. All right. The second one, the word substantial is really hard to clarify or to define, but there are organizations which are 501c3 organizations that do a lot of lobbying. The National Organization for Women and Parenthood, the National NRA, the National Right Gun Owners, and NRA. What does the NRA stand for? National Gun Owner, I don't know, the people who lobby about guns. They lobby a lot, and they are a 501c3. So now, thank you, Rifle. Thank you, Kayla. The National Rifle Association. I just lost that. So organizations that are 501c3s can and do lobby. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you how that works. But they can't use a substantial part of their funding to lobby. And substantial is not defined anywhere, right? And so it's a balance. And the Internal Revenue Service is in the unenviable position of having to figure out that balance. But you can't use a substantial part of your organization's funding to lobby. You can't use any federal funds, but you can use unrestricted funds. And unrestricted funds involve individual and corporate donations. Some foundations allow you to use lobbying for that purpose. And so that's one of the reasons why leaders of organizations like ours spend time fundraising. Not federal, not state government money, but other money, because we know we need to lobby and we need to do that with funds that are not government or restricted funds. Okay, only an insubstantial part of your budget. So again, these are IRS regulations, substantial, insubstantial. The IRS has to sort through all of that as far as how much your organization's time and energy is used to lobby. And again, other funds, private funds, individual, corporate, and then some foundation money can be used. Most importantly, and this is really important for those of you who might be doing this work with other funds, document, right? Make sure it is clear when you are doing direct lobbying, if you're going to do it, that you're doing it with non-federal and non-state funds. So all of this is really complicated. And I'm going to stop talking and see if anybody has questions or comments. All right. So, Michael, let's go to the next slide. So there are really a lot of rules, right? And one of the reasons that I am here as the director of your coalition is that this is my job to do it on your behalf and on behalf of the people you serve. So understanding and navigating the rules really are something that I take seriously and spend a lot of time doing. And I'm here to answer your questions, and I'm also here to just handle it on your behalf. But here are some, go back, Michael, if you would, some sort of undergirding principles. If it's about specific legislation, it is lobbying. If it's about political candidate and or a public question, it is lobbying. Now, if you are going to hire what's called a compensated lobbyist, not me, because you don't technically hire me. I work on the behalf of everyone in this work, but you need to call me. There are more specific rules about this that are regulated at the state level. It's complicated, and I am here to help. We employ a compensated lobbyist. So does ICADV. So do a number of other umbrella organizations around the state. And those are rules that, as I said, get very complicated. All right, let's move on, unless there are questions. So why do we do this? Let's take a step back from all the rules about how, but let's talk about why. Well, I mentioned a minute ago that everything important requires resources. And we serve survivors, and we want to make our communities safer. And that's why we do everything that we do. And building support for public policy change is part of that. Educating, helping our policymakers understand not only what we do, but why, and why resources to do it are so important. And that's not just elected and appointed officials, but everyone in the community. Everyone has a stake in making sure that sexual violence is reduced, people are safe, that everyone in our communities are safe, and that people who do experience sexual violence have a trauma-informed, victim-centered experience. And all of those things are really important, and public policy comes in to play in that arena. And we need to have resources to do that, right? We have to have money, staffing, volunteers, make sure basic needs are met, not only of our survivors, but of the organizations that we are running. And then expertise. Trauma-informed, victim-centered are words that we throw around, but they are very specific ways that we do our work. We have to understand them, we have to center our work around them, and we have to help our partners do the same. Partners from law enforcement to healthcare to K-12, higher ed, all the people that come alongside in the work that we do. And all of that requires expertise, training, assistance, and money. So that's why we do the kind of work we do in the advocacy space. Michael, you can go to the next slide. And then how we do it, well, we're going to do it together, because it really is the only and the best way. So how do we do it together? Next slide, please. There we go. Let's take a step back, because I cannot help myself. I was not a high school government teacher, but I think I might have wanted to be another time in my life. We need to go back and just quickly understand the levels of government and how all this works. Legislative government is the branch of our three branches of government that make the law. Federal, of course, is Congress. State is the General Assembly. We also use the words the legislature, the Indiana General Assembly, the IGA. These are words that are interchangeable. So when you hear me say IGA or the General Assembly or the legislature, I mean the same thing, which is the group of people at the state level who make policy change and pass our budget and do those things. At the local level, our legislative branches are our city and county councils. They are the ones who make local law. And so those are the three levels of our legislative branch. Our executive branch is called executive because it executes or enforces the law or carries out the law. And so that branch of government at the federal level, of course, the president and federal agencies, I've listed some of them here that we interact with: Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. As I know all of you know, based on the election we just had, all of those organizations are going to have new leaders. New leaders will have new thoughts and new ideas about how they do their work. And that is another thing that we're paying attention to on your behalf. State is the governor and the state agencies that are under the governor: Division of Child Services, Family and Social Services, Indiana Criminal Justice Institute, the Department of Corrections, and on the list goes. We also have a new leader at the state, which means we will also have new leaders at all of those agencies, right? Lots of change. Again, it is also our job to help you understand and navigate what all that's going to mean. So that's on my list and our list here at the Coalition. At the local level, executive branch office holders are county commissioners, mayors, and then others, including school superintendents and township trustees who may or may not interact with our work. The next slide, please.
Beth, I think Haley had her hand up for a second.
Oh, great. Okay, please.
But I don't, Haley, do you want to ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was gonna put it in the chat, but I was just trying to process the part where you were talking about 501c3s can participate in lobbying efforts with unrestricted funds. But I got confused when I thought I heard, but it cannot influence specific legislation, but can, I guess, in other words, you can educate or inform them on how that might impact the work. Am I understanding that right?
Not exactly. And I'm sorry because I've been unclear. 501c3s can do direct lobbying about specific legislation without the use of federal or state funds. They can use federal or state funds for the education and general advocacy purposes. In other words, you can use federal and state funds to do a campaign about things like We Start by Believing, or it's Sexual Violence Awareness Month. And therefore, we talk about trauma-informed care. We talk about help is available. We talk about First We Believe, right? And those kinds of things can be considered education or advocacy. And you can use federal funds for those, but you cannot use federal funds for specific legislation. Does that make better sense?
Yes, I think I'm just trying to conceptualize like what it would be that we specifically would be.
I understand.
Also,
in our situation with it.
For your substantial, that word substantial comes up again, right? So for your unrestricted dollars, you can't use a substantial amount of your budget, can't be toward one specific lobbying effort, right? So that's where that comes into. You can certainly lobby with unrestricted dollars, but if at the end of the year or your fiscal year, you realize, I'm just going to pull a number. I don't know that this is exactly how the IRS figures it, but like 51% of your budget went toward advocating at at different lobbying levels. That might be a red flag, and you would want to look at that. So as long as it's not for that rule of, specific legislation, it's if the reason you exist is to lobby, that's a different category of 501c3 than if you're a victim service provider and you also just happen to do some lobbying on the side.
Haley, I don't know what organization you work for, but the leaders of where you work, unless you're a leader, of course, should think very clearly about what you're spending and what you're doing and how you're doing it. And we are here as a resource, always. So you or a member of your organization, please reach out and we will navigate all of that together.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Sure. So moving on through our little high school civics lesson, just real quick. The local legislative branches, the city councils, mostly depending on what city you're in, are in districts or they have large members, they control local issues, which are listed here. The county councils, city councils are the same except for a specific city. Township boards work with trustees, and the specific thing that they do that relates to us really are what we call poor relief. We don't use those terms anymore, but that's what's in statute. For things like emergency housing assistance, utility assistance, those kinds of things that might be available to sexual violence victims. And then, of course, we all know what school boards do, and those are our local legislative branches. Moving on. And local executive branches, of course, county commissioners control the money in the state of Indiana. Mayors, township trustees, again, poor relief, emergency assistance. And then the school superintendents who do what they do, which is run the schools. Go ahead, Michael. So there's so many people and so little time to think about how to engage with all of these people who may or may not be doing things that can help you. So it's what I always say is, again, we're going to do this together, and it's all about relationships. If you are thinking about advocacy in your community for specific things relating to the work you do, get help, divide and conquer, talk to your board, talk to your staff, talk to your SART, which is Sexual Assault Response Team, which is a multidisciplinary group. Think about where relationships already exist so you don't have to build them already, or that relationships exist that can help you. Go ahead, Michael. how can you find out who these people are? Because it may be a great mystery in your community about who all of your elected and appointed officials are. This website that's right here, and I think Michael will drop it into the chat, is a really great resource. You put in your address, your literal street address, and it will pop up all of the levels of government about who are your elected officials. I live in Indianapolis. I live in Warren Township. I live in the IPS school district. I live in a state rep and a state senate district. So I have a township trustee, which is different from who my legislators are, which is different from my city council, which is different from who represents me in the school district. So I can just go there and they're all listed right there, everything from the president on down to my township advisory board and everything in between. Now, state legislators in particular are the IGA website, which is Indiana General Assembly.indiana.in.gov or government, G-O-V. And that's your Find Your Legislators. That's a great tool, not only just to have the names, but it also links to a bunch of information about those people, including their background, what their district looks like. A map is available there, which is hugely helpful. When I am trying to figure out, I need a legislator in Bluffton. Who's the legislator in Bluffton, right? So I can go to my Find My Legislators and it will bring me maps and it will show me who represents what areas, and it's enormously helpful. So I recommend that resource as well. Some counties in Indiana have really good websites, which will do the same for your city council districts or your county council districts, or even your school districts, by the way, to give you maps and show you people and pictures and how to contact them. Some counties, not so much, to be honest, and that requires a little bit more digging. But it is digging that can be done, and certainly, depending on what you need from these folks, can be a really good resource. Let's move on. And once you figure out who these people are, you need to reach out to them. Ask them for a meeting, invite them for a tour of your facility so they can learn more about your program. Go to meetings that they are holding. Right? Many of our legislators do what they call town hall or what the third house, various names that they have for them. There are ways on the IGA website to sign up for newsletters, which are helpful. And you can sign up for the newsletter of your state rep or your state senator, and that's a way to connect with them and find out what they're working on. Other ways, of course, just talk about getting to know them better and what issues they care about. Some of the legislators in your areas do not necessarily agree with you about various issues that relate to our work. And that is to be expected, but there is going to be common ground, I promise you. Making our community safe, that's got to be common ground. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a legislator who would say out loud, I don't care about communities being safe. So they will tell you that they do, and there are differences in how you think that can happen. But I promise you there is common ground. And then again, find out what else connects you through other groups and communities of interest within your area. In a small town, I call Indianapolis a small town with tall buildings, because what I discover the more I get to know people is that there's just all kinds of connections. My son plays ball with a kid whose dad is doing this and whose mom is on the school board and various things. And so you realize those connections the more you look for them, and that those connections can be enormously helpful. Michael, let's go ahead. Building relationships with folks who are in positions of influence take time. It's the long game. And those relationships should start, essentially without an ask in particular, but then you can move to an ask. Talking about how to engage with school districts, prevention, sexual assault awareness issues, internships. Are there high school students who are interested in your work? Would they like to come and volunteer in your program? Can you get into the schools to do prevention work? What about law enforcement, right? What do your mayors and police chiefs or sheriffs, what are their appetite for engaging with you? Are there trainings or other opportunities to engage? Can you get a mayor or a city councilor or a superintendent of schools or someone else to engage with you during Sexual Assault Awareness Month or other times? Are legislators interested in getting legislation started? And if so, please talk to us or ICADV, because they do that in the domestic violence side. What do these folks have that you need? and how can you work with them to get what you need? Because those relationships they're not transactional exactly, because I don't want to say it that way, but they are about mutual assistance and help. Michael, let's go ahead. Tending and feeding those relationships is also important. Again, it's the long game. So what if it isn't going to work out this year, or if they're busy all the way through April, maybe next year, or maybe in September or October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, or maybe a back to school event with your K-12 partners, or I don't know, right? Every community is different, and every community has different ways that they're going to engage. You and your staff and the clients and the survivors that you serve live in these communities, and they are constituents of these elected officials, and they have a right, and you have a right to be represented by these folks. And you should take that right and responsibility seriously and start engaging with them. Now I'm going to stop talking because I think that's my last slide. And I want to see if anybody has questions or comments. Okay. This last slide is a useful resource. Of course, the IRS has lots of talk about what a 501c3 can do and not do. The National Alliance to End Sexual Violence is our federal partner, and when I have a question about all of this, which I often do, I go to them because they are an enormously helpful resource. And other coalitions around the country are working in these very same spaces, doing this very same work. Every legislature is different, and every community is different, but a lot of the themes are the same, and we work together to try to help each other. And our National Alliance to End Sexual Violence works at the national level in Washington, Congress in particular, on our behalf, and also with the Department of Justice doing some advocacy there. So as I'm here to help you at the state level and the local level, they are there to help me and others at the federal level. So there is a network of folks who are engaged in this work. And that is my last slide. And let's see, there we are. Some other resources we've put in the chat. Yeah, Coburn. Oh, Haley, great. You work at Coburn. Wonderful. Great. Coburn is a great organization. So yeah, political director at AFL-CIO. Well, God bless. You know how this works. All right. Anybody else want to make a comment or put any questions or comments in the chat? And with that, we are concluded. Everyone take care, and we will see you in the new year.